Welcome to Westside Unscripted, the podcast where pastors loosen their ties, throw away their notes, and answer questions about all things theology and culture. And I'm Josh Bartels, the assistant to the pastors here at Westside, and I'm joined by Pastor Peter, and he's here without a tie, without notes, and ready to answer a question from one of our members.
I just feel like the throwing, I never wear a tie, so the throwing away the tie part is always thrown before a loop. I do normally have notes, though I didn't prepare any notes that I've now thrown away, but
Yeah.
I do normally have notes. So the absence of notes is definitely
That's definitely a new thing for the podcast.
That's distinctive to the podcast.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have what other things, what is the most bizarre thing you've had notes for?
Oh my.
Is there something really specific and detailed that you've made notes for that no one else in the world would have made a note for?
I mean, the list of things I haven't made notes for is definitely shorter than the list of things I've made notes for.
Okay. Yeah, well, one day maybe we'll have a good I
think actually the oddest, if I'm going to have full confession, which I didn't refer to this last baby dedication because, I remembered what to do, but I think the one that Ashley has gotten the biggest kick out of is I had like detailed notes of like exactly what to do with the baby when I did my first baby dedication.
Okay.
Describe the baby, hand the baby back to the parents, like exactly what to do at each stage so that I didn't mess it up. Which I didn't read those notes, but I think that's probably I do have them.
Nice. Well,
so that
just in case, just to keep things from going off the rails. So what have you been reading? What have you been finding helpful, interesting this week?
Well, I've been reading a bunch of different stuff, but there was one book I wanted to talk about, and that is Christine Cohen's The Winter King. Usually I talk about, theology and culture books. This is a story, sort of middle grade, maybe upper middle grade fiction. Some of you may know Christine Cohen wrote The Winter King. This is her second book, and it's called The Sinking City. And I really, really enjoyed it. We have it in the bookstore now. It's just a romping, fun story. The first, the Winter King has more of like a mythic sort of feel, and the Sinking City has more of a fairy tale, but like non-Disneyfied fairy tale, which is that's how the author describes them, and I think that's really accurate. So it's a really fun world. It's set in sort of an alternative reality version of Venice. For those of you who have read The Tale of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, the world feels a lot like that. It's not that. It's different from Strange and Norrell, but it's a novel by Susanna Clarke that was written for adults, but it feels, she's obviously read it and gotten inspiration. It's not by any means plagiarizing, but it feels like that sort of, in a way, like not completely, but anyways, Have you read Strange and Norrell?
No, I haven't. But it's a set in in London. It's
set all over England.
Oh, okay.
But they do go to Italy at one point, maybe Venice even.
Wow.
So there's a portion of it that's set in Italy, but just some of the feel is similar. Yeah. But it's a sort of like magical world. But to me, the big takeaway, the reason I would mention it on this sort of podcast is because it's a book written by a Christian. It's not like really explicitly Christian, but it takes the trope of like, girl tries to make it in a boy's world, and like everything in our culture from Disney takes like girl and boys clothes to like suddenly she's so liberated from the constraints of her femininity and she discovers how wonderful it would be if she didn't have to be a woman, and it takes that and turns it inside out. I won't spoil the ending of the story, but it takes it and it undermines it, turns it inside out.
Yeah, if you were to describe
knocks it on its head and dumps it like a cement load on top of it.
So you haven't described the plot exactly, but it's basically a girl.
Oh yeah, I didn't give any introduction.
Ends up
to the
having
plot.
to act like a boy to escape danger, and she
terrible
has to,
danger
over the course of time, like so a prolonged pretending to be a boy. But so if you were to describe that in an our cultural setting, it would be immediately like red flags. I'm going to screen this to make sure my kids, it's okay. But this story does exactly what you're saying. It takes that idea and says, hey, let's see what that is really like. And tells a fun story that turns that whole thing on its head. And it's really
it just like, I'm not a girl, obviously I'm not like, so it's, written by a woman with the main character as a girl. I loved it as a story, but I'd imagine if I was a girl and I was thinking that would be cool, it would completely subvert those ideas and leave you longing to be what God made you to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that is tremendously valuable in our society. And, it also shows what happens when men don't do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of father failure and, young men who fail to be what they're supposed to be. And then also some who do step up to the plate in significant ways.
It doesn't candy coat the problem with men while
exactly.
dealing with the issue of femininity. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fairy tale in the classic sense of like the world is out of control and people have to do really courageous stuff. It's more like a fairy tale like St. George and the Dragon than like, Disneyfied fairy tale princess, where it's got those layers of darkness and scariness, but I thought it was really good.
Cool. We'll check that out.
The second thing I wanted to mention, and it has a connection to this because on this podcast, Josh mentioned this, disconnected, because we both already read it. So Josh has a podcast, some of you may not know that, called the Foxfire Farmhouse. And he did not ask me to mention his podcast, and I have not mentioned it till now, but his last episode, I think it's titled something. So I guess now there's another episode I haven't listened to about something about the story of Esther, but his is about digital media and storytelling. And this last one deals with some essays by C.S. Lewis on storytelling. And I just thought it's he and Elijah Heyman do it together. And it was a really insightful conversation. I thought was really, really good. And I'd like to commend that to you. Now, I will give one disclaimer. I told Josh when we were talking before the podcast, and I said that I was going to mention that I would give this disclaimer. Josh and I do not always see eye to eye on what movies Christians should watch. So we've had some robust discussions about that. But I found the episodes of the podcast that I've listened to have been really thoughtful, helpful, beneficial. And I think if you're interested in storytelling, you should look that up. And particularly that episode was really good.
Wonderful. Yeah, we enjoyed doing it. So... Well, let's get on
we should get on to what we're supposed to be talking about.
Today's topic here for this podcast, and that is going to be polygamy. So here's the question. It's a little bit longer of a question, so we'll have to sit with it for just a second. But here we go. Now, obviously, polygamy was a thing in the Bible. So, and this is coming from the person who wrote the question. I've long held the viewpoint that having multiple wives is wrong in general. But if a man already has them, he ought not to divorce them down to one. And that if a man with multiple wives come to Christ, he ought to instead maintain his wives and be the best husband to them that a Christian can be, because that's the responsibility he's taken for them. He's got headship over them, and so that's what he should do. So here we go. Firstly, do you agree with that kind of approach to a polygamist who comes to Christ? Why or why not? And then secondly, how would you approach then the reverse issue of a polyamorous woman? Now that stuff like that's becoming more popular in society, where you've got a woman with multiple men, what would you recommend to the woman? So here we go, a big ethical deep dive. Into
the sting was the tail on that one.
Yeah,
that was the first part of the question is pretty straightforward. Yes, I don't. I think that even if there's something, because I think God hates divorce. And so if someone is actually married, and clearly, scripture portrays that there can be situations where someone can actually be married to more than one woman. And that's not the case in America. One marriage would be legally invalid in some way. But there are countries where this is a real issue. And there have been divergencies of missionary practice. I strongly agree. A man has multiple women. He's taken to himself. He's married to them legitimately. He's not living. He's not, polyamorous in terms of having just multiple relationships, but he actually has multiple wives. He's responsible for their care. And he's responsible. I mean, we find this principle in Exodus. It's addressed to a polygamous society. You take another wife, you are responsible to, provide food, provide clothing, and provide intimacy. So it's not, making one, all the wives live as widows except for one. You're responsible to provide everything that you provide in a marriage to all the women that you've married. And so to me, that's clear. And so, it's not, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the biblical commandments here in the next few weeks in the series on Exodus. It's not saying that this was God's creational plan for society to be structured in that way. But it is teaching us what God's justice looks like so the law codes that make provision for polygamy. It's not saying polygamy is a good thing. Jesus makes it clear God's creational intent for marriage is found in Genesis. And, God didn't, provide Adam with Eve and Edith. He just provided him with Eve. So that's the creational plan. But we live in a world in which there are many deviations from that creational plan. And so, in the time period of Israel, the two biggest ones would be slavery and polygamy. And yet God shows what it would look like for God's righteousness to, so if you have slavery as an accomplished fact, what would it look like to be a righteous slave owner and a righteous slave? I think we may have mentioned that at some point in the household codes. In the New Testament, that's still an issue. If you have a world in which polygamy is an accomplished fact, what would it look like for the gospel to be nudging that? Now, obviously, you shouldn't, seek to replicate that and, create that somewhere where it's not. But so to me, that part's pretty straightforward. I think I would make a distinction between, polyamorous relationship and I would. The question is like legally. So the problem is marriage is being so emptied out so that it's no longer inconceivable that you could have, a throuple or something where you have multiple men and one woman or something. But it just really seems like, so there hasn't been a society in history. There have been one or two odd societies that it's debated if they were described accurately that had some sort of relationship like that, where you had, one woman being shared by multiple men. That just tends to work out so badly. Like men wouldn't, historically have not handled that very well, that it doesn't seem to have really been an issue in many places. I'm not saying it never has been. So I'm struggling to imagine, but we've also have transgender. So we have such a remaking of the creational order that it's.
Whereas it seems to me that if we were to look at both of these scenarios, that one of them is hypothetical for our context, but we can look at Africa or other places and we can say it's not a hypothetical situation. It's a real one. It's just hypothetical to us. Whereas the other one is really more hypothetical in general, because it doesn't seem to me that there are I don't know of anything personally or historically where that kind of thing has been a legal common practice, where you've got some kind of binding marriage agreement between multiple men and one woman.
Right.
And so we're moving in a direction that one can imagine just about anything, because there are no tethers to like what people are doing. But it seems to be more of a hypothetical that is really actually playing out a hypothetical.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, could you be married to a horse? Well, I suppose our society could redefine something. There was I believe it was in Sweden or somewhere in in Europe, where there was a man who married his robot doll. But it was so somehow it became a legal thing. So that thing can happen, but that's not a common practice. So in sort of like, you have God's creational intent for marriage, and then you have like marriage as, for the reality of human hard-heartedness that you have defined in Deuteronomy, where a man takes a wife and he's responsible to provide certain things for that woman. He's taking on an obligation to provide those things. And, it becomes then possible to take on that obligation for multiple women. Mm-hmm. Whereas what a woman is ultimately undertaking to provide is exclusive devotion to that man. That really is, that's all that's, she becomes his. That she is his is what is expected of her. So, then in the same way that you would say, a robot doll can't give exclusive devotion because a robot doll can't give devotion at all. Right. And nor, does a robot doll have any need, it's not a human being. Mm-hmm. You can't marry. Yeah. Whereas you could have a distortion of marriage, like polygamy is a, distortion, or you could have a bad marriage. Whereas I would say, marriage to a robot doll is marriage in name only and isn't marriage at all. And so I think I would want to say something, insofar like it's a difficult thing to conceive because it hasn't really been tried in any substantive way. It's like so it's like transgenderism and some things like that it's so anti-creational that it's sometimes difficult to even know where to start because it is just so contrary. Mm-hmm. So I would suspect, if someone in that situation actually came to faith and tried to live as a Christian in other areas, because that's just so anti-creational, I would suspect the problem would be solved for them. Yeah.
And it would seem to me that, even the way that the question was worded was a polyamorous woman, which is different than polygamy, because polyamory is the love of multiple people. So it would be more
polyandry would be if you actually had, and from an ear for man. So polyandry would actually be the technical name for marrying multiple husbands. Okay. And I just, my suspicion would be that, yeah, it just seems to me that idea of exclusive devotion to one man, in that there, that obviously that's a creational intent that it's supposed to be exclusive devotion both ways, but there are concrete things that the man is supposed to provide for the woman that enable that shift to polygamy to take place in a lot of societies across a lot of places in a way that just doesn't work in reverse. So I'm sure there'll be, I just don't see that catching on widespread to be like a live issue for a lot of people. I sense it being more like but who knows? We live in a crazy world.
We do live in a crazy world, and who knows what kind of ethical dilemmas we'll have to untangle in the future. But for now, thankfully, that is mostly a hypothetical. So.
Yeah, I don't know how far I think the first part of it was straightforward and the second part of it is hypothetical and it's difficult to know. Like you'd have to know like the concrete, the concrete details of what it would be. But
indeed. Well, this has been another episode of Westside Unscripted. We've tackled a rather fun and hypothetical, interesting question today. If you've got more of these, preferably not of the wildly hypothetical kind, because those ones can just lend themselves to speculation. But if you have any questions about theology and culture, we'd be glad to take a stab at them here on the podcast. So send them in to Josh at Bible Direction for Life, and we will get them queued up for later episodes.
I have one more thing.
Yes, go ahead.
So we've got quite a few questions about how Israel relates to the church, about the Ten Commandments, about the law and the gospel and all those things. That's been something that's been touched on a few times. And so I just wanted to mention that we're going to be covering some of that in more detail, not unscripted, on Sunday nights in our Exodus series. So we are getting to the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 19 through 24. And so the next few weeks, we'll be diving into some of that stuff in some more detail. And I've been sort of whistling by at almost supersonic speeds the past few weeks in Exodus. So I'm not going to slow down to Matthew speed or anything close. We're not going to go verse by verse, but I'm going to take a few weeks to dig into some of these principles in a little bit more of a prepared way. So if you're interested in those questions, our Sunday night series in Exodus would be a place to come.
Wonderful.
Hear some of that.
Yeah, we'll show up for that Sunday nights at 6 o'clock here at Westside, or if you are listening to this somewhere beyond the geographical proximity of Westside, then you can check out the Bible Direction for Life podcast. That's the preaching and teaching podcast of Westside, and you'll be able to hear all of those and follow along with it there. Well, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate each of you listening, and those of you who send in questions, we appreciate your participation. And we will join you again next week for more talk about theology and culture here on Westside Unscripted.